perspective is post-Cold War, Washington Consensus comes on and the government embraces a very free trade, very free market agenda that on a macro global level has been exceptional for creating wealth, for uplifting billions from poverty,
right.
And has seen a light touch role from government that has seen industry develop organically, so to speak. For the 90s and into the 2000s, that seemed fairly well, where we did have a trade-off of small-scale deindustrialization, manufacturing declined out west, as the higher costs there pushed industry away towards Asia and other developing countries with much lower manufacturing and labor inputs. This was seen as an acceptable trade-off. The West was complemented by an explosion in services, consulting, finance, folks who make podcasts. So the economy was going fairly well for a while. Global financial crisis in 07, 08 did tip the scales in a political sense, in that despite global growth increasing and national GDP increasing, there were very strong pockets of impoverishment throughout parts of America and Europe, the Rust Belts, that made politically difficulties. The government, nevertheless, states did not intervene in any meaningful sense. They did speak rhetorically about the need for more industrial capacity and creating middle-class jobs, manufacturing jobs. But the forces pushing those jobs away continued robustly, and we did see a collapse of manufacturing from about 30% of America's employment and GDP to the mid-teens. Similar numbers here in the UK. Germany was one of the few that bucked the trend and stayed strong in manufacturing because the government held on. The conversation we're having today, as you fast forward to the present, we've realized that if you don't decide on industrial policy through a government, somebody else will decide that for you. And in the Western case, that was largely high finance. The capital flowed to the most lucrative, the most remunerative possible processes, including the selling off of an asset in the West, reestablishing it in Asia, particularly in China. The challenge we faced was two things changed the dynamic. The first was COVID. We realized that once these free trade borders started to shake and we couldn't rely on our trade partners, we couldn't rely on just-in-time production, we couldn't manufacture a lot of things at home. We couldn't make very simple things like face masks. We couldn't make vaccines, much of all. We couldn't adjust to these shocks. We saw these massive lineups out of Los Angeles port of hundreds of ships waiting to dock, and we realized just how fragile industrial capacity was and just how we exported so much of our state capacity towards trading partners. The second event that really tipped the scales was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That made us realize that those trading partners weren't particularly reliable, and the costs of doing business with them could be tremendous. Russia's gas was the cheapest source of gas for many years, but we realized last winter that those costs then came with tens of billions of pounds or euros or dollars had to be invested to make up for that difference. The environmental and security risks weren't properly factored into the market price, is what we're realizing. We're also realizing that we need to get a bit of a better control of our resources as well. We can't rely on third-party actors to deliver for us. What's really been acute for my conversation on the climate transition is on critical minerals and critical metals. These are things like cobalt, lithium, nickel, very much in the news. What's happened with China is China's played a fantastic industrial strategy, just as the West abandoned the very notion. They started investing in EVs and other climate technologies over 20 years ago, plowing in tens of billions of dollars. And the critical mineral component is really at the center of their strategy. They took on the very messy, not very lucrative work of extracting rare earth materials and things like nickel and manganese, processing it at home, very environmentally disruptive process, very poor labor conditions you have to work with, and then selling it at a loss out to the West. So they would sell it time and again for decades below the cost of processing and extraction. But they would lose tens of millions of there, and then they would gain billions by attracting first lower end and now advanced manufacturing with assured access to those critical supply chains. Saying, well, instead of us shipping our nickel or our lithium or cobalt over to Europe or America, very expensive process, how about you set up in Guangdong and Shenzhen, build your facilities here, and we'll give you a very good treatment, and you have a guaranteed domestic market to produce it by. That's been exceptional for them.